The quarterback situation in Pittsburgh might be starting to reveal a few clues. And if you've been following everything surrounding the Steelers this offseason, there's one moment that really caught the attention of people around the league. Aaron Rodgers recently appeared on the Pat McAfee show for a long conversation that lasted more than 90 minutes. On the surface, it felt like a typical Rodgers appearance where he talked about several topics and didn't necessarily give direct answers about his future. But if you listened closely, there were a couple of comments that may have quietly hinted at what could be developing between Rodgers and the Pittsburgh Steelers. During the conversation, Rodgers was asked about the Steelers' coaching staff and some of the recent hires the team has made. That's when he specifically mentioned offensive line coach James Campen, someone who had a significant impact on his career earlier on. Rodgers talked about how much respect he has for Campen and even mentioned how the two used to go out to eat together while traveling during their time working together. It was one of those moments where you could hear a little more enthusiasm in his voice than usual. And then he said something that stood out. The coaching staff could be a draw if we go down that path, followed by the phrase, "It takes two to tango." That line might not seem huge at first, but around the NFL, phrases like that usually mean there is at least some level of mutual interest. The Steelers, according to several conversations happening around the team, appear to believe that Rodgers could end up in Pittsburgh. In fact, there is a sense that the organization expects a decision from him relatively soon, possibly within the next week or two. At the same time, Rodgers being Rodgers means there is always an element of unpredictability. Until he officially says yes, there's always that mystery hanging over the situation. Another interesting detail from Rodgers' comments was that he said there is currently no contract sitting in front of him waiting for a decision. That raised some eyebrows because teams usually want clarity before putting a full contract on the table. The process likely begins with a simple question: are you playing football next season? If the answer is yes, then discussions about terms and salary can begin. For the Steelers, that answer matters a lot because it influences nearly every other move they might make during free agency. Think about it this way. If Rodgers is coming to Pittsburgh, the entire roster strategy shifts around him. The type of wide receiver you target changes, the amount of money available for other positions changes, even the offensive structure can change depending on the quarterback's strengths. Rodgers has always thrived with certain types of receivers who run precise routes like slants and quick timing patterns. So if the Steelers believe Rodgers is their guy, they would want to build pieces around that style of offense. At the same time, there are fans pushing for other directions. Some believe the Steelers should pursue Kyler Murray if he becomes available. Others point toward younger options like Will Howard and argue that the team should develop a new starter internally. But the reality is that relying on a young quarterback like Howard right away would be a huge gamble. Even supporters of the idea admit that he would need time to develop rather than immediately stepping into the starting role. And this brings up a bigger picture conversation about where the Steelers really are as a team right now. There's a growing belief that Pittsburgh is still in the later stages of a rebuilding process. The offensive line has been rebuilt piece by piece. The defensive line is still being developed. Young core players like Joey Porter Jr. and Nick Herbig represent the future foundation of the roster. But even with those building blocks, the team still needs additional pieces before it can truly consider itself a Super Bowl contender. Quarterback alone probably won't change that overnight, whether it's Aaron Rodgers or another veteran option. The Steelers likely see the position as a bridge while the rest of the roster continues to take shape. That's why this decision matters so much. If Rodgers joins the team, it might be about stabilizing the offense and giving Pittsburgh a chance to stay competitive while the long-term future continues to develop. At the same time, another move already gave us a glimpse into the team's thinking on offense. The Steelers released tight end Jonnu Smith, a move that creates about $7 million in cap savings and clears up what had become a crowded tight end room. Smith was scheduled to carry a cap hit of over $10 million, and the production simply didn't match that number. The move also reinforces how important Pat Freiermuth is to the offense moving forward. Around the league, some teams had quietly looked at the Steelers' tight end situation and wondered if Freiermuth could become available because Pittsburgh seemed to have a surplus at the position. But the Steelers quickly made it clear that they had no intention of trading him. In fact, the expectation now is that Freiermuth will see a larger role in the offense going forward. With Smith gone, the depth chart becomes much clearer. Freiermuth sits at the top, and Darnell Washington continues developing into one of the most unique players on the roster. Washington has impressed coaches with both his blocking ability and his physical presence. And there's even discussion about potentially extending him in the future because of how valuable that type of player can be in the offense. And if the Steelers truly want to unlock their offensive potential, getting Freiermuth more involved could be a major key. There were moments last season when simply targeting him more often seemed to open the entire offense. Defenses suddenly had to respect the middle of the field, which then created better opportunities for the wide receivers outside. All of this connects back to the quarterback question again, because if Aaron Rodgers really is the first domino in this entire offseason plan, then the Steelers are likely waiting for that decision before making several other important moves. So now the big question for Steelers fans becomes this: if the choice truly comes down to Aaron Rodgers returning for another season or Pittsburgh exploring another quarterback direction, which path do you think gives the Steelers the best chance moving forward? Because once that first domino falls, everything else in Pittsburgh's offseason starts to make a lot more sense. The quarterback decision isn't happening in isolation. It directly affects how the Steelers approach free agency, how they structure the offense, and even how they evaluate trade opportunities across the league. One move that already gave us insight into the team's direction was the release of Jonnu Smith. It wasn't necessarily a shocking decision, but it was a meaningful one. Smith carried a cap hit of about $10.8 million, and by releasing him, the Steelers clear roughly $7 million in cap space. For a player who didn't produce at the level the team hoped, that was always going to be a tough number to justify. But what makes the move more interesting is what it says about the tight end room and the future of the offense. Around the league, when teams looked at the Steelers' roster during the Combine, many of them noticed something unusual. Pittsburgh had what appeared to be a surplus of tight ends. When other teams see that, they start asking questions. They start calling around. And the player that generated the most curiosity was Pat Freiermuth. Now, it's important to clarify something here, because this story started to evolve once it spread across different outlets. Teams were not sending serious trade offers to Pittsburgh for Freiermuth. What was actually happening was much simpler. Executives around the league looked at the Steelers' tight end group and thought, there's no way they keep all of these guys. From that perspective, Freiermuth was the one player other teams would be interested in acquiring if he became available. When those inquiries happened, the Steelers made their stance very clear very quickly. Pat Freiermuth was not available. Pittsburgh had no intention of moving him, and once Jonnu Smith was released, that message became even clearer. The depth chart is now streamlined, and Freiermuth's role in the offense should grow significantly. Last season, there were stretches where he was only playing around half of the offensive snaps. Moving forward, that number could easily jump into the 60 to 70% range, possibly even higher depending on the offensive structure. And if you watched the games closely last year, you probably noticed something that frustrated a lot of fans. Whenever Freiermuth became a focal point of the offense, things started working. Drives moved, the rhythm improved, defenses were forced to adjust. There were multiple games where the offense struggled early, then suddenly Freiermuth started getting the ball and everything clicked. The crowd at Acrisure Stadium would start chanting Muth, and the entire energy of the game shifted. That's not something you ignore if you're building an offense for the future. The other name that continues to generate excitement inside the building is Darnell Washington. When he came into the league, there were questions about his knees and whether his long-term durability would be an issue. But so far, Washington has proven to be incredibly reliable. Outside of a broken arm, he's barely missed any time, and he's slowly starting to unlock the full potential that made him such an intriguing prospect coming out of college. Physically, he's one of the most unique players in the NFL. A massive blocker who can also be used as a red zone weapon is something every offense values. And there's growing belief that he could become an even bigger part of the passing game moving forward. In fact, some inside the organization love the idea of eventually extending Washington and keeping him as a foundational piece alongside Freiermuth. The logic is simple. Players with his combination of size, blocking ability, and developing receiving skills don't come around very often. Now, if you zoom out and look at the offense as a whole, the potential structure starts to become clearer. DK Metcalf remains the primary threat at wide receiver. Freiermuth becomes a central target over the middle of the field. Washington provides physical dominance in the run game and the red zone, and the Steelers are still widely expected to target another wide receiver in the upcoming draft. Adding a young receiver to that group could make the offense significantly less predictable. Defenses would have to decide where to focus their attention, double-team Metcalf, and someone else gets favorable matchups, commit resources to stopping the tight ends, and the outside receivers suddenly get more one-on-one opportunities. That's the kind of balance offensive coordinators dream about building. But then we arrive right back at the same question that started this entire conversation. Who is the quarterback running this offense? Because if Aaron Rodgers truly is the player the Steelers expect to lead this team next season, then everything we just discussed starts to align with a veteran quarterback trying to maximize one more competitive run. The roster isn't being torn down. The core isn't being traded away. Instead, the front office appears to be strengthening the nucleus they already have. And that approach also explains why the Steelers don't seem eager to become massive sellers in the trade market. There has been speculation from some fans about moving major players like TJ Watt or Alex Highsmith to collect draft capital, but nothing coming out of the organization suggests that kind of reset is being considered. In fact, the opposite appears to be happening. Pittsburgh continues building around its young core while keeping its veteran leaders in place. That doesn't look like a team planning to start over. It looks like a team trying to stay competitive while continuing to develop its future pieces. So the next few days could end up being extremely important for the direction of the entire franchise. If Rodgers gives the answer the Steelers are expecting, the rest of the offseason plan likely moves very quickly after that. Now, I want to hear from you. Do you think Aaron Rodgers actually ends up in Pittsburgh? And if he does, can this roster realistically make a serious push with him at quarterback? And there's another layer to this entire situation that Steelers fans should keep a very close eye on. Because while everyone is understandably focused on the quarterback conversation, moves happening around the league could quietly shape what Pittsburgh does next. We've already started to see teams making aggressive decisions even before free agency officially begins. One example that caught attention around the league involved the Kansas City Chiefs making a significant trade, sending cornerback Trent McDuffie to the Los Angeles Rams in exchange for a first-round pick and additional Day 3 selections. When a move like that happens, it immediately sparks the same question for every other team. Should we be buyers or sellers in this type of market? For the Steelers, the answer appears to lean much more toward being buyers rather than sellers. There simply aren't many players on the roster that the team seems willing to move right now. The front office has been very consistent in the message that they are building around a core group of players rather than tearing things down. But interestingly enough, there were quiet conversations during the NFL Combine about whether Pittsburgh might get involved in the McDuffie situation if the price dropped. The Steelers, like several other teams, are looking for help at cornerback opposite Joey Porter Jr., and with the amount of cap space Pittsburgh currently has, they technically could have afforded to bring in a player like that if the cost made sense. However, the reality is the price never dropped to that level. Once the discussion centered around a first-round pick, the Steelers were never seriously in play. That kind of move simply doesn't align with the way this front office typically operates unless the player is viewed as a true cornerstone piece. So when you look at the current roster and try to identify possible trade candidates, it actually becomes very difficult to find obvious names. Some fans have floated the idea of trading TJ Watt, but everything the team has indicated suggests that's not even being considered. Watt is still the centerpiece of the defense and one of the most important leaders in the locker room. Others have mentioned Alex Highsmith, but again, the Steelers seem committed to maintaining their pass-rushing depth, and that's where another fascinating storyline begins to emerge around Nick Herbig. The plan within the organization appears to be attempting to re-sign Herbig and keep that trio of edge rushers together. From a football standpoint, it makes sense. Over the past several seasons, the Steelers have learned how quickly depth at that position can disappear. One injury to TJ Watt or Highsmith suddenly forces the defense to scramble for answers. Keeping 3 high-level edge rushers gives Pittsburgh protection against that problem while also allowing them to rotate players and keep everyone fresh